G'day and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast demystifying the big economic issues in Australia and putting them in plain English. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Institute, and today we're bringing you more guests from our webinar series. Today it's Professor Megan Davis, Jamie Lowe and Michael Mansell to talk about treaty and sovereignty. And this webinar is part of the National Treaties Summit, organised by Australians for Native Title and Reconciliation, or ANTaR, the National Native Title Council and the University of Melbourne to create a national dialogue about the importance of agreement making and a chance to compare and share experiences from Australian jurisdictions, to explore international experiences and to contribute to the momentum of treaty and agreement making across Australia. This is just one of a number of webinars that will be held in the lead up to the summit, which unfortunately had to be postponed due to the pandemic. And importantly, while Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples are the primary stakeholder in treaty, the summit is also an opportunity to influence non-Indigenous Australians. As with reconciliation, treaty must be owned and committed to by all parties, and all Australians need to understand what treaty is and why it's crucial for them.
The Australian Constitution is the only constitution of a First World nation with a colonial history that does not recognise its first people.
Right now, black people across the country are mobilising to push for a treaty. And right now, I ask that you back them.
New Zealand, Canada and the United States all have legally enforceable treaties, but we don't.
Recognition that it was we who did the dispossessing. We took the traditional lands and smashed the traditional way of life.
We'll exercise our right to say who we are, what we are, and how we want to be represented. And
we are the first people. We never ceded our sovereignty, never. A treaty could have true recognition. A treaty could talk about truth-telling. A treaty can look at reparation.
We are the sovereign owners of this country. I am a Wongatha Yamaji Nunga Gitja. We have never ceded sovereignty. I am tired of begging and asking for our humanity.
And seeing us as animals and not as people, that shit needs to stop. Black deaths in custody, that shit needs to stop.
The Aboriginals owned Australia, and today he demands more than the white man's charity. He wants the right to live.
We seek constitutional reforms to empower our people and take a rightful place in our own country.
We were privileged to host 3 distinguished speakers to talk about treaty and sovereignty, and you'll hear some short remarks from each panellist before we get into a discussion. Professor Megan Davis is Pro-Vice-Chancellor Indigenous at the University of New South Wales. She's a Professor of Law and a constitutional and human rights lawyer. She's a Cobble Cobble woman from southeast Queensland, and she's of South Sea Islander descent. She also participated in the United Nations Working Group on Indigenous Populations, which contributed to the development of norms in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and she's a key voice from the Uluru Statement from the Heart. Jamie Lowe is CEO of the National Native Title Council. He's a Gunitjmara Djab man, and Jamie's also the director of the Federation of Victorian Traditional Owner Corporations, and he advocates for the rights of traditional owners within the state of Victoria. He was previously CEO of the Eastern Maar Aboriginal Corporation, appointed by the Federal Court to hold native title rights and interests for Eastern Maar citizens over their country in southwestern Victoria. And Michael Mansell is chair of the Aboriginal Land Council of Tasmania. He's an Aboriginal lawyer and activist who has dedicated his life to social, political and legal reform to improve the lives and social standing of Aboriginal peoples. He petitioned the Queen for land rights in 1976, and he successfully campaigned for museums in Tasmania to surrender the Aboriginal dead that they held. And he was legal director of the Tasmanian Aboriginal Centre until 2013. They were joined by our chief economist, Richard Dennis. And first up, we heard from Professor Megan Davis. This was recorded live on Wednesday, the 15th of July, 2020, and things may have changed since recording.
Thank you, and thanks for that introduction. I'm having a bit of few internet problems this morning, so hopefully I can resolve them to get through the full 10 minutes. I just really had 3 points I think I wanted to start with, and I should start by saying hi to Jamie and Mick. I think these kinds of discussions are really important because it's important to bring the community along insofar as these really significant law reform matters when it comes to Aboriginal people. Look, I wanted to really just do three things. I just wanted to talk about what sovereignty is, because there are multiple meanings of what sovereignty is. And then I wanted to talk, secondly, just about the relationship between sovereignty and treaty. And then third, I'll just end by talking about the Uluru Statement from the Heart and why it is that voice treaty truth and that law reform approach was considered a way to resolve that issue between sovereignty and not resolve, but sovereignty and treaty. So I'll talk to that. So to begin with, really, I think it's important to make the point that sovereignty actually, it has many contested meanings and multiple meanings. So what Australians think sovereignty is, or what the United Nations think sovereignty is, or what Aboriginal people or Torres Strait Islander people think sovereignty is often different and mean different things. I mean, ultimately, at the end of the day, sovereignty is a really fundamental question, a fundamental legal and political question about where the ultimate power or political and legal authority in a society is located. And when we talk to Australians, they will say, well, our political and legal authority is located in the Parliament, or it's located in the British Crown. And obviously, when we, for example, ran the Uluru Dialogues, we heard a very different story from Aboriginal people and Aboriginal polities who continue to practice Aboriginal culture and maintain their legal and political traditions. So, for example, the Ross River Dialogue run by the Central Land Council, their people spoke about sovereignty as Jukupa, the word that's used for where their laws come from, and how the laws were laid down by the ancestors to regulate people's behaviour and governance. So I think everybody comes at it from a different perspective. And in this day and age with, the United Nations and international law and trade agreements and the World Trade Organization, it's not really very straightforward or clear cut. And I refer there to Senator Lydia Thorpe, who said, if we negotiate a treaty, that should be supervised by an international body under international law. So there you can see that here we are drawing upon the sovereignty of international nations to supervise something like a treaty in Australia. The point being, people vest their faith, I think, and in particular, or many different forms of sovereignty. And I think occasionally in Australia, the courts have been asked to decide on Aboriginal sovereignty, and it comes as no surprise to anybody that they have not wanted to go there and have ruled that out, and that comes as no surprise just simply because our courts were created under the Crown, and the High Court, for example, owes its authority to the Crown. So you would expect it to say something like that when it comes to a strict legal question in the confines of the courtroom. And generally, sovereignty inhabits a political space, I would argue. So it doesn't have the hard edges of black letter law. And so, as I said, while some will say sovereignty is located in institutions like Parliament and government, others say sovereignty resides with the people. And so there are many that argue Australia's sovereignty resides with the Australian people, because it is the Australian people who can change change the constitution at a referendum, and that's known as popular sovereignty. And then Aboriginal people have an entirely different concept, as I said, of what sovereignty is, but it is to do with the basic authority, and that basic authority resides in the hands of a First Nation. And that's why people generally don't propose a singular treaty, but multiple treaties to recognise that particular Aboriginal First Nation and their their laws and their governance. And the most important thing I think that came out of some of the dialogues was that sovereignty is not something that can be taken away by a government or a court. Or should I say, sovereignty is not something to be activated by a government or court. That is to say, Aboriginal people assert their sovereignty on a day-to-day basis, and they demonstrate that through their actions and their words as sovereign people. And we hear, as we did at Uluru, we said our sovereignty wasn't ceded, and we are sovereign people. So this brings me to my second point about the treaty. So really, I think we accept that sovereignty is not something that the Crown and Indigenous peoples ever really agree on. And if you look to Canada and the United States and New Zealand and the multiple kind of treaties in those jurisdictions, there are really different views between First Nations peoples and the government as to who has sovereignty and who doesn't. And I think the interesting thing about this, and I think Mick, in my kind of old memory, I think we generally agree on that at this point, and that is that whether or not, how people agree on sovereignty and how it might be shared or overlapped, that question doesn't have to be a roadblock to proceeding with reforms. It shouldn't be a roadblock just to stop all reforms and stick with the status quo. We shouldn't assume opportunities as they come along if they're going to have beneficial effects for our people. And you can see that in Canada, where they pursued modern treaty making, a modern treaty making process, along with constitutional recognition, and both of those things have provided substantive rights and structural power. Although we all know from social media and through the media that things aren't perfect in Canada either. The notion of sovereignty and the resolution of this issue in treaties, this is an ongoing thing. There's never a point where it's completed or concluded. So we accept then that sovereignty is not something that the Crown and Indigenous peoples generally in the end agree upon. So that's where a treaty can come into play. You can agree to disagree on that and then move on to negotiate on matters as to, you come to the table, the state and First Nations as sovereign people, asserting sovereign authority to negotiate an agreement. And that, like I said, might be an agreement to disagree on matters of sovereignty. But you agree that whatever you negotiate has binding legal effect, and you move on. And I think that's a really important point, and one I think Robert French made really well before he joined the High Court, about a treaty being, agreement to disagree on some facts and then moving on and negotiating, what a treaty might look like. So really the last point I wanted to touch upon is this question, I think, of whether signing a treaty harms sovereignty, but in particular whether constitutional change or a voice to Parliament harms a claim to sovereignty. And I just wanted to make some quick points here. Look, the courts in Australia refuse to recognise any sovereignty today, except Crown sovereignty. And as I said before, that's not surprising, right? Because these are the court set up under the British Crown and the current Australian legal political system as it exists. So we can assume that there can be no adverse impact upon on our sovereignty in terms of what the Australian courts will say, because their position will always be negative on this point. Look, the expert panel in 2011 grappled with this question because so many Aboriginal people were concerned about treaty and constitutional reform and ceding sovereignty, and the expert panel found that the general and I think the legal advice was provided by Brett Walker SC, that there was no significant act post 1788 that acquiesced to the Crown. So when Aboriginal people say today that they have not ceded their sovereignty, then that is a matter of fact. And there's been no act since then that has foreclosed or terminated or concluded that sovereignty. So if Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people assert today that their sovereignty has survived in some form, in a way, for example, that an institution comes out of a treaty commission, for example, might recognise it, then it has survived. And it survived many things. It survived the enforcement of law against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people since 1788. It survived the creation of colonial and state constitutions. It survived the 1901 Federation and the Commonwealth Constitution. Our sovereignty has survived the extension of the power to the Commonwealth in Section 5126 in terms of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, the power to make laws for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And I'm referring there to the 1967 referendum. And it survived the making of laws after that. So it's really difficult to see how it, insofar as the voice to Parliament, how another amendment to the foundational law authorised by the Australian people, such as in 1967, can actually have a terminal effect upon sovereignty. Sovereignty is not ceded in that way, and I think the same point has to be made about a treaty. And I know people get very confused about the concepts of sovereignty and treaty, and that's okay because they are very complex things. But I think a treaty is a way to address that. And so my final words, I suppose, would be, why then did the Uluru Statement foresee the voice coming before a treaty? Look, Australia is a colony where the British came and ignored people and their legal systems and their societies, and they started setting up their own. And they did that without treaty or consent. And John Howard agreed on this point in 2000. It's not, but it's not surprising that this is a contested and debated space. But the Uluru Statement says that sovereignty asserted by the Crown coexists alongside the sovereignty of First Nations, and that has never been ceded. That it has survived. And it's a very important point, I think, to understand why it is that the statement issued this invitation to the Australian people to engage in a political process, a referendum, insofar as to make a legal change. That is to say, to entrench a First Nations voice in the Constitution, and then later to establish a Makarrata Commission to establish a process of agreement making and truth telling. And we say that is giving a fuller expression to Australia's nationhood by recognising a shared sovereignty. And it's important there to remember that federalism, and the Latin, term for federalism, means treaty and compact. We have shared sovereignty across the Australian continent through the Commonwealth and the states and the territories. So it's not an uncommon thing in our legal and political system. So just finally, why did treaty come second? There were very different views about treaty across each of the dialogues. But what you found was in areas where there was strong native title recognition, there was a fair degree of fatigue with agreement making. Because agreement making and treaties, it's a legal, you're moving into a legal realm. Lawyers, law firms, and differing interpretations of that text. And that's important to keep in mind. So in those areas with strong agreement making, treaty ranked very low and the lowest in some areas. And then in a lot of areas, people said that native title had ripped communities apart, and that before we could enter into treaties, we needed some dispute resolution and healing ourselves, and that people weren't ready to enter into a treaty with the state. So I think that's a really important point to end on. And with the territories and the states engaging in treaty making, what we discussed and came out at the other end in terms of Uluru was that those treaties are really vulnerable. They're vulnerable because the Commonwealth has the power to override the states in Section 109 and the territories in Section 122. So if you don't have the Commonwealth at the table, it makes it very, very vulnerable to override. And that's why we need a voice in the Parliament first.
Thanks, Megan. We might come back, I'm sure, to some of those issues that you've raised. Next, we'll go to Jamie Lowe. Jamie?
Yeah, thanks, Ebony. And I think Megan's opening there was excellent oversight of kind of all things, and especially kind of the short history within Australia in regard to kind of sovereignty and treaty, and I guess most recently the Uluru Statement in 2017. I guess for me, I've been lucky enough to be elected as one of the representatives on the First Peoples Assembly down here in Victoria, and we've been charged with the duty of kind of negotiating a framework for treaty, a self-determination fund, and also a independent umpire to I guess resolve matters through agreement making and treaty making. So I guess what Victoria seen some 5 years ago said that we recognise that our people have been asking for treaty for 2 centuries now, and we thought it was time to actually kind of move into the treaty space. So I guess that's where kind of Victoria's at. I'm not going to get too much into detail. I'd rather kind of ask some questions today with some of the people that are listening in. So I think Megan covered quite an extensive array of what treaty could mean or what sovereignty means and the interactions between those two. What I will say though is the right or self-governance is an inherent right for our people. I think native title, although there's many issues with native title, what it did do was recognise actually some sovereign rights for our people. It recognised that we had laws and customs pre-colonisation or pre-invasion. And so without kind of getting into the detail of all the things that are wrong with native title, it does recognise actually elements of sovereignty within the nation. I guess it's something that we can build on. I guess since the Mabo decision in the early 90s, nearly 30 odd years ago now, I guess we have been in a kind of, situation of kind of limbo. And I think Australia as a nation hasn't kind of moved forward since that decision back in the early 90s. So I think that it's time for treaty. And I agree with Megan that the Commonwealth needs to come to the table. And if that's through constitutional recognition, or and some people may debate there's other mechanisms of doing that. I think that us as a nation need to kind of get on with it and start making agreements and treaty making with our Indigenous peoples. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jamie. And next we'll go to you, Michael Mansell.
Well, we all know that there's a lot of issues that Aboriginal people want addressed. The high imprisonment rates, the poor health and housing conditions, the lack of political representation, the lack of financial resources, and so on. And treaty comes into that discussion because treaty is one of the mechanisms of dealing with that whole range of issues. For example, the welfare response to health and housing and imprisonment rates is in Close the Gap. So that's one mechanism that the governments of Australia, both federal and state, are using to address those social welfare issues. On the question of land, governments have left it entirely to native title since 1992, so not much is happening with land. On the question of political representation, you've got two models, each of which require legislation for them to come into effect. On the one hand, you've got a voice to the Parliament, which is an advisory body sitting outside the Parliament. The alternative view is you have 6 Aboriginal representatives, one from each state, in the Senate. Now, for either of those models to get up, you need legislation. And the point I'm making there is that we are accustomed to dealing with one particular issue at a time. It's either close the gap or seats in Parliament or a voice outside the Parliament or native title. We don't deal with a whole package of those issues all brought together. That's where a treaty comes into it, because the whole point of a treaty is to look at the structure that has put Aboriginal people in the position that we're currently in. What changes do you need to make to that structure? And how do you build into a piece of legislation called a treaty the things that will turn those discriminatory practices over 200 years around so that Aboriginal people are free to rebuild our communities? based on our values, our culture, and our aspirations. And so you would expect that if you're going to have a treaty with Aboriginal people, it would have to deal with land, it would have to do with political representation, a financial base, and it would have to deal with a whole range of issues that allows Aboriginal sovereignty to be expressed to different communities in different ways through that treaty. So I see that as the value of a treaty. That is, it's bringing all of those issues together in a package.
Thank you very much, Michael. And I might just start with a couple of questions myself before we get to questions from the audience. I can see we've got over 1,400 participants today from all around the country. So thank you very much for joining us today, everyone. We're really glad that you could come along for this discussion. One of the questions, I guess, picking up on some of the things that you've all talked about this morning is that idea that sovereignty has inherent legal and political rights. So we all know that there are many Aboriginal nations across Australia. How does the existence of multiple sovereignties existing in parallel work, and what implications does that have? Megan, I might come to you first on that one.
Oh, you might want to go to Jamie on that one because they're in the middle of negotiating a treaty, so they might he might have more.
Yeah.
Well, I think what happens. So so Australia already has recognised various governance systems. Yeah. So we've got states, territories. We've got the federal system. We've got the local government system as well. So I think that moving towards negotiating treaties, and I think Michael made a really good point that, a key element of treaty is being able to self-govern, to be able to recognise that and us to be a self-determined and self-govern, and whether that's kind of reserved seats within the state government or, if it was a Commonwealth negotiated treaty within the Commonwealth government, I think that would be essential. So I think that we get kind of stuck in this kind of, can we do it, can't we do it? Does it become more cumbersome, etc.? Do we give more rights and more power to the First Nations people of this country? I don't get kind of caught too much in the technical detail of it or the law, because I'll leave that to the kind of the lawyers to figure out. But what I do recognise is that I don't think it's too far of a stretch to be able to do that. We made a decision a couple of weeks ago at one of our chamber meetings where Victoria will begin negotiating multiple treaties and also a statewide treaty. So it'll be a hybrid model. So there won't be a single treaty within Victoria. There'll be multiple treaties negotiated with nations. But there will also be a representative body, and we haven't talked about what that would look like, and maybe it's a Aboriginal Parliament here in the state of Victoria, where they will be charged with negotiating also statewide treaties and elements that that may address. I think to Michael's point earlier, statewide things like law and justice systems that have ruling over our people, etc. Education systems. We know that these state-based systems have been letting our people down for centuries, decades. So it would make sense to us for us to self-determine and control our own destiny and our future. So that's kind of where we're up to in Victoria at the moment.
Thanks, Jamie. Richard Dennis, you're our chief economist. I guess thinking about treaties and what Australia enters into, we obviously make treaties with a whole range of other international countries, with UN bodies. We enter into things like free trade agreements and whatnot. Michael also touched on, some of the health and education implications and things like the Close the Gap initiative. Where do you see all of this sitting, and what are some of the implications?
Thanks, Ebony, and thanks to all the presenters today. It's it's so useful and so important to hear these things expressed so concisely. And look, so often we're told that now is not a good time. These are important issues, and whether it's constitutional recognition or whether it's closing the gap or all sorts of issues in relation to Australia's Indigenous peoples. We just hear so often, now is not the time. But it's important to remember we've just had 29 years of uninterrupted economic growth. The economy grew for 29 years in a row, and every politician, state and federal, that was in power in that 29 years took credit for that, said, how good am I at managing the economy? In 29 years of steady economic growth, we didn't find the time to address these things. As soon as the economy starts to contract, the same people say, oh, now's a terrible time to talk about it. So if we can't talk about it when the economy's growing and we can't talk about it when the economy's shrinking, when can we talk about it? Now, as you said, the nation state of Australia spends an enormous amount of time and money negotiating treaties all the time, whether it's free trade agreements, whether it's defence agreements. We as one of the richest countries in the world have enormous capacity to solve multiple problems at the same time. I mean, can you imagine in the UK saying, now's not a good time for Brexit. Let's wait till the economy's perfect before the English and the UK citizens were allowed to consider Brexit. So yeah, for Australia, this is so obviously unfinished business. And I guess from an economist's point of view, all I'd say is this has got nothing to do with economics. It's really important that people understand that in Australia, as you said, we deal with treaties all the time, we deal with social issues all the time, we deal with defence issues all the time, we deal with unexpected pandemics when they come along. We've put this off for too long. There's no economic reason to do this. It's purely a political choice to delay it.
Thanks very much, Richard. I've got another question here from Dean Tregenza. He says, the Constitution enables Parliament to establish additional territories without going to a referendum, and using this mechanism to create one or more territories that are co-present to the existing jurisdictions perhaps would enable First Peoples to identify as citizens. He asked, would this be a useful way to recognise First Peoples as having sovereignty and to create a space for a council or treaties? I'm not quite sure of the detail on that one, but perhaps to that idea of what the Constitution allows. Megan, did you want to respond to that type of a question?
Look, the most recent piece of work that was done through the Referendum Council on this, there wasn't a huge support for that, and that's because that kind of approach just elides the fact that there are traditional owners in those spaces that are owners of that country, that belong to that country, and that needs to be a conversation to be had before we move forward in terms of creating either a territory or reserve seats for that matter, and so there's a long way to go, I think, on that, and including the other part of the equation, which is political will for that. But so I think when we discuss that issue with people, it can be quite controversial because you're asking people to give up their land or share their land, and you need to have that conversation with them depending on what that looks like. I don't know. And with reserved seats and seats in the Senate, I think that designated parliamentary seats were discussed in the Uluru Dialogues, and it's really important for us to keep in mind the nature of contemporary Liberal democratic governance, and that is party discipline and party ideology dominates that space because of the nature of the minimalist 3-year ballot box democracy that we have. And you see with designated seats or reserve seats across the world that they've all become subject to party politics. It's just the nature of how parliaments function. And I think that's why people wanted their own voice, because once you join the Greens, you become a Green voice. Once you join the ALP, you're a Labor voice. Once you're in with the Liberals, you represent your electorate and you represent your party. And I think the dialogue is very clearly distinguished between, and those seats might be a great idea down the track, but what they wanted was a black voice from First Nations that could speak to the Parliament.
The next question is from Michael Bradley, who asks, how do you respond to arguments like Keith Windschuttle's that the breakup of Australia, a treaty would divide Australia and create separate Indigenous nations? Michael Mansell, perhaps I'll come to you on that one.
For that argument, it's been divided since 1788. What we're talking about here is providing a share of the cake for those people who had the whole of the cake, had all of it taken away by a bunch of military-backed racists, and who then established a white nation called Australia and have given back to Aboriginal people little bits and pieces. And a treaty is saying to white Australians, you have a moral obligation to not just look after your own mates and the own people of your own race. You've got a moral obligation to do something about the injustices that Aboriginal people have suffered. And when you look at the question of dispossession, why is it that after more than 200 years, the bulk of Australian land is still called Crown lands? And the governments who claim Crown land rights took that at the point of a gun from Aboriginal people and through ethnic cleansing. So the country of Australia is not going to fall apart if native title is suddenly recognised in 1992, like the doomsayers did say it was going to cause a massive crack in the property rights of Australia as we knew it. It didn't happen. Nor will Australia fall in half if a treaty recognises, for example, that all the Crown lands in Australia go back to Aboriginal people. Governments would still exercise jurisdiction over Aboriginal people on those Crown lands, but the lands would be returned to the original owners from whom they were taken at the point of a gun.
Ebony, on the Windschuttle point, Mick's absolutely correct. You know, the High Court in Mabo, you know, it found that the development of the nation was based on the dispossession of our people, and that the political economy of the Australian state was on the basis of dispossession and killings. So it's really important to keep that in mind, like that we need to address that as a nation, that it's an unresolved legal and political matter, and people might disagree on how that is resolved, whether it's through, you know, the Uluru reforms of Voice Treaty Truth, or whether it's through some other mechanism. But it's not something that, as Mick said, will fracture the state. They're the kinds of arguments that are used just to maintain the status quo. But we enter into agreements, as Richard said, with international entities on a day-to-day basis. We, you know, the whole federal system is a form of shared sovereignty. Aboriginal people enter into agreements on a daily basis with mining companies, etc., through native title and land rights. It's just one of those arguments that people put up, and not so many people anymore. I would say Mick's right. Mabo was painted as something that would disrupt the property law system and fracture the state, and that wasn't what happened.
Ebony, can I just add that also, you know, just earlier this year, we for the first time created a national cabinet. I mean, we know how to build new structures to deal with new problems when we want to. And I'm not saying the National Cabinet is the perfect solution for this. I'm saying that as a society, as a modern democracy, we know how to evolve previous structures or develop new ones whenever we want to. And all of the things being discussed today are clearly within the realms of democratic possibility. They're just not at the centre of our political attention. We know how to do new things when we want to. We just haven't, you know, our elected leaders, state and federal, to date, have not wanted to do it enough.
Thanks, Richard.
Ebony, I'll just like to jump in as well and just kind of double down
Jamie.
on the comments from Megan and Michael. You talk to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander person across the nation, the nation's already fractured and divided. I think it's also an important point that we're not pan-Aboriginal people. We're many nations of people, Aboriginal people, Torres Strait Islander people with different customs, different belief systems, different ways of doing business. So that needs to be recognised. And I think native title did recognise that also. And I also think that this is why a key element of this process is the truth-telling process, being able to tell the truth to the nation, and the nation being able to accept the truth, so we can move on with agreement making. Because the scare tactics of I think Richard's point that we're never in the right economic climate to be able to do agreement making with our First Nations people. Your backyard's going to get taken. All these things that get thrown around, they're myths, and they've been myths in this country for 200 odd years. And I think the truth-telling component is crucial to be able to bust those myths.
But Ebony, Richard makes a really good point about the National Cabinet during COVID. When the government needed to shut down the nation, who did it turn to? It turned to the states and territories, and then it turned to the experts. It turned to the epidemiologists and the public health specialists. When they wanted to reopen it, they went to economists and business and the corporate sector. And when they wanted to close Aboriginal communities and reopen Aboriginal communities, they went to the Aboriginal sector, right? The point being that we have systems in place that can, when it chooses to, deal with these really complex matters. And as Richard and others have alluded to, we decide not to apply that when it comes to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander affairs, except they did when it came to COVID.
Yeah, it's a really good point. The next question here is from Julie Fenley, and there's a couple of others that kind of touch on similar issues, and I think we have touched on it a little bit, but it's probably worth coming back to. So Julie asks, in overseas countries, the creation of treaties has been interpreted as a ceding of sovereignty, and will the very act of engaging in a treaty lead to the ceding of sovereignty? And I had a separate question that I thought was linked that kind of asked, are examples like New Zealand and other international examples that we could look to explain that interaction? Not sure who'd like to take that one.
Yeah, well, a treaty between Australia and Aboriginal people, no matter what it's got in there, wouldn't detract from further assertions of Aboriginal sovereignty, because it's a package deal dealing with the particular content that is in the legislated treaty. I think Megan touched on this earlier, that if there was a treaty made this year, it's very likely that the word sovereignty would be left out, because the Australian government would still claim it is the national sovereign along with the states, and therefore it doesn't recognise Aboriginal sovereignty. Aboriginal people, on the other hand, would say, listen, we are the sovereign people and we're not conceding to you white governments that you have sovereign rights over us, so you can just leave that out. But in the meantime, the treaty might say, for example, that the Commonwealth can acquire all of the Crown lands in Australia, or get the maps out and have a look and say, there you are, those lands there should come back. A treaty could say that a national Aboriginal representative body is now to be established with a representative from each of the states and territories, and they would coordinate the application of the treaty rights to Aboriginal communities around the country. And part of that deal might be that 3% of the gross domestic product in Australia goes to that body, and based on Aboriginal priorities, that those funds are distributed, which is a lot more money than what we get now. And of course, then we want to be part of the decision-making process. So instead of sitting back waiting, lobbying a Minister for Aboriginal Affairs, there should be at least a representative seat in each of the states set aside for an Aboriginal person elected by Aboriginal people, so that they are free, as Megan said, they're not compromised by being Labor or Liberal or Greens. They go into the Parliament free to represent and agitate on behalf of Aboriginal people. Now, none of those things detracts from Aboriginal sovereignty. It just means a piece of legislation that's picked up a whole range of issues that Aboriginal people say has been left untouched for too long. They are now dealt with in a treaty, and that when the farmers go up and get their subsidies every year, when they have a drought, it's not the end of the ball game for them. They're never told, don't come back. So it should be the same for Aboriginal people. The moment the treaty is signed, we all enjoy those treaty rights, but we continue to agitate for those rights that are not included in the treaty, because not everything is going to be included in it.
Megan or Jamie, did you want to add to that?
Well, I'd say it's to the contrary. I think you get a set of rights and you can negotiate those through treaty, and I reckon they can recognise elements of sovereignty. And because we need a baseline here, and I think Michael's point's right. You can build from that. It's not the final deal, and you see in other international jurisdictions where treaties have been made and been struck, but it wasn't the full and final kind of deal. I guess as a treaty, they keep on negotiating. It's not the final payday, so I think that's an important point to be made. And I think once you get a set of rights, you can build on those set of rights and create further rights from that. And I think the GDP is a good one. For example, here in Victoria, I think Michael talked about the Crown lands. We've had all our land taken off us. Like if you give the Crown land back in the CBD of Melbourne, there's no Crown land left with the Rawandjeri and the Boonwurrung people there. So maybe there's a GDP argument to be had to self-determine. I think the economy is a key element of sovereignty. And if we talk about GDP in Victoria, I think the GDP is around 450 billion. So if we were to talk about 3% or even 1% of that to enable us to self-determine and self-govern, I think that would be a pretty good starting point.
Yeah, can I just jump back in there? That the best way to appreciate whether a treaty could express Aboriginal sovereignty in a practical way is to look at discrete Aboriginal communities, that are remote from the cities. It is possible that a treaty would say that traditional land area of yours is now part of an Aboriginal title. Then the treaty would say in those situations, those discrete Aboriginal communities can have the complete unfettered right to select their own political structures and their own political representation. They decide law and order, including customary law, whether it will apply, if it does, how it does. They would have the right to decide policing. They would decide a whole range of economic and cultural issues like education, housing, and the general welfare, including land use and planning. And so these are the whole bundle of rights that are easy to be applied to discrete Aboriginal communities. Now, in that case, you could say, well, they're exercising the rights of a sovereign state within a state. That is, they're exercising rights similar to the state governments subject to the Australian Constitution.
That touches on another question here from Amelia Van Uwick, who asks, is there a place for smaller scale treaties between individual Aboriginal groups and their local government, for example, councils? And what advice would you give to Aboriginal groups and communities trying to instigate negotiations with their local government or otherwise? Megan, did you want to respond to any of those comments?
Well, I mean, I'll just quickly touch upon sovereignty and other jurisdictions, or treaties in other jurisdictions. And I think the point is correct that if you look to Canada, New Zealand and US, there is significant dissatisfaction with treaties and the way in which governments dishonour that. And I think we need to be hard-headed about that, because I think there's a lot of utopian ideas out there about how treaty applies to Australia, and Australia is a very, very different jurisdiction to other states. It's very hard to do what we're doing now, retrofitting recognition so far from dispossession. And I think we need to be cautious about the things we talk about, including, GDP, law and justice, all of those matters, because there's still the political work that needs to be done to make this happen. The Commonwealth won't come to the table, just on a moral argument. And so there's a lot of work to be done before, we can bring some of these big picture ideas even to the table, which, I just want to emphasise the real vulnerability of state-based treaties and territory-based treaties to the political government of the day. South Australia is a good example of Labor being voted out, Liberals coming in, and then wham, it's all over. And that's partly why the Uluru Statement from the Heart, why the dialogues felt like you needed some Commonwealth mechanism to help negotiate the kinds of things that Mick was just talking about. You do need a voice there negotiating this, and it needs some teeth, because these are really complex agreements, which leads to this next question, I suppose, about agreements with local governments. Look, communities can do agreements with whoever they want, really, First Nations, and I suppose, and they already do, and I guess we've been having that conversation about a lot of agreement making looking a lot like service delivery models, right? That's not what treaties are about. If people want to negotiate with local governments, that's an important. First Nations can do that, but at the end of the day, you need a coordinated approach across the federation, because you can do. They are complex legal agreements. And I keep saying that not to kind of make it sound elitist, but when you do travel to other countries who have treaties, it's like a lawyer's, picnic. It's great for Mick Mansell. You can be a treaty lawyer, but it is a lawyer's. It's a legal document. It needs to be interpreted, and it often ends up in court. The interpretations, and Jamie's right. Like there are ongoing negotiations. And there's ongoing conflicts with it. It's really important for us to understand. And I think Mick and I agree on this. It's certainly not the panacea. You need multiple kind of mechanisms at play in the system. He's referred to reserve seats. I referred to the voice to Parliament. You need multiple mechanisms to have leverage here at the table.
So you'd say, Megan, that an agreement with local government is not a treaty. It's just an agreement and shouldn't be called a treaty because a treaty deals with the bigger stuff.
Mansell, I don't know if I said, treaties, when you talk to communities about what treaties mean, and this is why the UN takes the approach of treaties, agreements and constructive arrangements. I mean, they can mean many things to many people. I think treaties they use historically, at least the international level, to apply to those historic treaties, right? The ones that were signed at first contact, and set out that relationship and legitimacy for Indigenous peoples in the population to follow. I would probably say that, treaty or agreement, whatever it's called, we know that originally in the 80s, the word makarata was used to apply to this because it is a process, right, Jamie? It takes a long time to get there. And the process is really important in terms of who's at the table and what you're negotiating and what's in and what's out. And I think that's part of some of the sentiment that was in the dialogues is, because of native title, for example, we're not even talking to each other. We need healing before we can come together as a First Nation to do these negotiations. Whereas some First Nations are ready to go now, probably. So it's just, we're all at very different stages. And the process is really important to contemplate. How will that be set up? And how will it apply across the federation? But you can call anything you want. I think.
The federal parliament could legislate it tomorrow.
Hey?
The federal parliament could establish a treaty commission tomorrow through legislation, and the treaty commission could take a draft treaty around Australia and say, "Here is a draft. Is it workable?" And that could come back to the federal parliament and they could vote it through and it becomes a treaty. That's how simple it is.
Well, Michael, that's precisely what we've done in Victoria. We established a treaty commission. That was about 4 or 5 years ago now. Now we've got the Assembly, which is established late last year. So there is a process, but we need a starting point. And if that's a starting point, I think we just need to get on with it and do it.
Yeah, I mean, the mechanisms are there, Mansell, but it's not that simple. Look, they're 4 or 5 years down the track, right?
What's stopping us from doing that, Megan?
Hey?
What's stopping us from doing that? Putting the treaty up to the Parliament?
The Commonwealth's not coming to the table, right?
Well, to Richard's point earlier, the political will, nothing else stopping it but bar the political will. I think to the question though around kind of local governments and traditional owners being able to negotiate treaties with local governments, I think local governments are critical. because that's where the relationship sits. Everyone lives in local government areas, yeah? There's 532 local governments across the state, across the country. It's pretty big. I think it's 532, it might be 533. But there's the good and the bad and the ugly of local government. So if you can build a relationship with your local government and be able to negotiate, what's under their powers to negotiate with them through that, I think all power to you. But I think they're a crucial kind of mechanism to build relationships with the local community.
Well, that's the interesting thing about the Noongar settlement, 2015. Like, we might remember that they got, I think, 1.3 billion. The Noongar settlement in southwest Western Australia was legislated by the West Australian state government, gave $1.3 billion worth of funds and land over a period, I think, of 10 or 12 years.
10 years, I think, Michael. Yep.
Was it? Yeah, 10 years, something like that. Thanks, Jamie. But one of the interesting things was that once the 300,000 hectares of land was given back to the Noongar people, it was subject to local government jurisdiction. Now, before the white people came here and took the land off the Noongar, they were not subject to the local government authorities. They didn't have to pay rates and taxes. They were exercising sovereignty. So one of my criticisms of the Noongar agreement is that the West Australian government, because they went that far, all they had to do was to say, well, the return of land is not subordinate to local government. These people get their land back and they don't have to pay rates to any local government. So, I don't think we're beneath the local government. I think we should be above it.
We've got 10 minutes to go before we wrap up, and I'm really sorry that we can't get to, all of the questions that are here today. We've still got above 1,300 participants here, so thank you everyone for your good questions today. I think we're covering a lot of ground. I've got a question here from Frank Kennedy, who asks, in establishing a treaty, how important is it for Australians generally to learn about the culture, spirituality and philosophy of First Nations people? And I guess I wanted to also come back to, I think, Michael Mansell, a question that we talked about earlier, which is some of those things, whether it's from that Noongar agreement or others, of what types of things can a treaty deliver as well? I'll start with you, Michael.
I thought Jamie was going to answer the first part of the question, and I was going to...
Sure. Yep. Jamie, do you want to talk about...
What was the first part again?
How important is it for Australians to learn about culture and, I guess, history as part of the treaty making?
I think it's important, but I think we're at a point now in 2020 where it's kind of warned Australian citizens there's enough information out there. It's on them to start learning about it. I think Aboriginal people have been putting themselves out there for a long time now, and so we've been on the front foot with it. So I think it's up to citizens of Australia to get out there and learn those elements. I think it's a critical part, but we're pretty fatigued from actually trying to tell people how it is. But to the point of truth telling, it's something that we're committed to.
Thanks, Jamie. And Michael, back to you. What types of things can a treaty deliver?
I think it can deliver land ownership. And if I can come back to that in a moment, it can trigger political representation either in the federal parliament, if it's a federal treaty, or in the state parliament, if it's a state treaty. On the question of empowerment, with discrete Aboriginal communities, it's more likely that they would want a greater control over themselves and what happens in their areas, more so than necessarily being represented in a parliament 1,000 kilometres away. But the different forms of political representation could be covered in a treaty. Aboriginal people don't have a financial base. Every year we have to go cap in hand to the white man and beg them for more money for services. We should have enough funds to regulate based on our own priorities a welfare response to the welfare needs of Aboriginal people, but we should have money left over that enables us to plan for the future. And that is, I think, land, political representation and finances are the key components of any treaty anywhere in the country. One of the tricky questions about Crown lands being returned to Aboriginal people is that if it was a federal treaty, the federal parliament has the power to compulsorily acquire state-owned Crown lands and hand them over to Aborigines. But the federal government has to pay compensation, so the bill would be fairly extensive. A second problem you've got is that, as Jamie's mentioned, there's not much Crown land in Victoria, so they would be looking for a greater access to funds to buy land back. Whereas in Western Australia, they've got the opposite problem. There's over 1.3 million square kilometres of Crown land and another 900,000 square kilometres of pastoral leases. Now, the West Australian government would say, well, the minerals cannot be included in any Crown lands that are returned to Aboriginal people because they employ 50,000 people in the mining and petroleum industry, and they bring in over $100 billion to West Australia alone. So one of the questions that we would have to work out is, do we insist that the mineral rights and all other rights that we had prior to the invasion are returned with the land that we get back, or do we make concessions and say that we have to compromise on a range of things, otherwise politically it won't be acceptable to any government in the country and therefore we'll end up with nothing? That's a question that we have to answer.
Richard, Dennis, I might come to you just quickly. The Australian Institute's obviously done a lot of work around mining communities and mining projects, but that idea of a financial base for Aboriginal people, how important is that going to be?
Look, it's very important, and of course, because Australia is not just one of the richest countries in the world, but one of the lowest tax countries in the world, there are so many win-win solutions sitting right in front of us. So people have probably heard of countries like Saudi Arabia or Norway. They have enormous natural resources, but unlike us, they actually collect them, they tax them, and they have what they literally call a sovereign wealth fund. Well, we're talking today about sovereignty. There's absolutely nothing in us preventing Australia from introducing a resource rent tax. From an economic point of view, it's a good idea, full stop. It doesn't matter what we do with the money. We are one of the only resource-rich countries in the world to literally give it away. So introducing a resource rent tax is a good idea all by itself. The fact that we could use the introduction of such a good idea to fund something as important as we're talking about today, to give Aboriginal peoples actual sovereignty by giving them a secure revenue base, there's literally nothing stopping us from doing that. I mean, the obvious analogy is, of course, the GST. The only way John Howard talked the states into supporting the GST and talked the premiers into becoming his salespeople was to say, if we had a GST, I promise I'd give all the money to the states. Okay, so we've done that before, it works. So why not have a resource rent tax and agree what portion of that, anywhere from 1 to 100, but let's hope closer to the latter, and say, okay, so here's a new revenue base. We didn't used to have it. It's paid by foreign mining companies on the enormous profits they make from resources. X% of that, where X can be anything up to 100, is to be given forevermore to be spent in the following ways by the following groups. It's politics 101. We're rich, we don't tax resources, and we could address so many problems at once if we wanted to.
I might just come to each of our panellists just for, if you can give me your final message before we wrap up here today. Megan, perhaps I'll start with you.
Yeah, sure. Look, I think some of the comments that have just been made are interesting, but they're also really theoretical and abstract, right? We can sit here and talk about things that we want, big picture things that we want, royalties, money, percentage of GDP, but there needs to be responsibility taken to make that happen politically. And I think that that's a really important point about all of the First Nations who came together through the dialogue process and at Uluru did in developing that legal reform framework of voice, treaty, truth. Because, if we had the power to make everything that's been said on this call happen, none of us would be on this call listening to this, right? We would make it happen. But, the days of kind of sitting around and coming up with really utopian ideas, I think by the time we got to the end of that constitutional recognition process with the Referendum Council, people wanted to match up legal aspiration with actual getting it done politically. And I just want to refer to the bloke who asked the question about, what do Australians need to do or learn, and it's true, we are fatigued from this question, but there are two parties to a treaty. There is us and there's the Australian people, right? The Australian state. So we do have to bring that community together or along with us. And I think that was part of the generosity of the Uluru Statement, at least the famous part of it, the one pager that talks to why the logic of that reform, why it is we're asking for that, for this, for Australians to walk with us on that journey. And I think we can't wait for any formal truth-telling process to happen. That relationship needs to, it's happening now. We know that polling, there's been an 8%, 7% polling jump in Australia in terms of support for a constitutionally enshrined voice to the Parliament. So we are living in a time where Australians, there is a sentiment that people want to address these matters in a way that is consistent with Australia's legal and political traditions. And so I think I thought that was a really important question about what more can Australians do, and what can they do to understand these reforms better. And I think, there's a lot of really amazing early histories coming out that explain to Australians about that political economy of dispossession. I think if you take the time to educate yourself about that history, it makes it much more easier to understand what sovereignty and treaty and voice to Parliament and truth-telling is about. So I think I probably, end on that, Uluru is a very generous but politically astute and pragmatic approach to this, using constitutional reform to get to the point where we can set up a Makarrata Commission and supervise this process of truth-telling and agreement-making across the Federation.
Thanks, Megan. And I'll also note we had a webinar a couple of weeks ago with Aboriginal health professionals from Aboriginal community-controlled health bodies talking about the response to the pandemic and how successful that had been. And people might want to check out the video of that webinar to see perhaps what exercising some sovereignty and control looks like, and this great success that they've had there so far. Jamie, to you, a final word.
I just think that, Victoria is kind of leading the way in this conversation, and I think that the rest of the country, Commonwealth and other states and territories can fall in behind us and look at our lead. Something that was as aspirational kind of and seemed unrealistic maybe 5 years ago. The leadership that was showed down in this state, which has been showing the leadership for decades, is showing that it can be done. We had the political will and we took it. So it's just kind of calling out other states and territories and the Commonwealth government to move forward and start negotiating treaties with your First Nation people.
Thanks, Jamie. And Michael, a final word to you.
Yeah, thanks, Ebony. I think from the federal point of view, the politicians are being criticised for lacking the backbone to enact a treaty, but they would probably respond by saying, where is this treaty? Since the Reconciliation 2000 drafted in their appendix a treaty, no one has ever presented the federal parliament with a draft treaty and asked them to enact it. So the next move's up to us to put it in front of the politicians and say, there it is, we want you to pass the legislation.
Thanks, Michael. So we'll have to wrap it up there. Thank you to everyone who's come along today. Thank you specifically to our panellists, Professor Megan Davis, Jamie Lowe and Michael Mansell. This This has been a special episode of Follow the Money, and we're aiming to bring you shorter but more frequent episodes during the pandemic, so please stay tuned. I'd like to express our thanks to the 3 panellists, as well as to ANTaR, the National Native Title Council, and the University of Melbourne for helping to organise the National Treaties Summit. For more details on upcoming webinars, you can visit National Treaties Summit, all one word, .com.au, and you can keep an eye on tai.org.au/webinars to register for future webinars. We're on Twitter at the Oz Institute with an AUS. My Twitter handle is Ebony_Bennett with a NNT. Megan Davis is at MDavisQLDER. Jamie Lowe is at Jamie Robert Lowe. Lowe is spelt with an E on the end. And Michael Mansell is at Mansell APG. Richard Dennis is at RDNS_TAI. And this episode was produced by Jennifer Macey. Our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum. And remember, stay 1.5 meters away, keep washing those hands, and thanks for listening.